Hi, today we're speaking to Dr. Nicholas Chadi on vaping. How are you, Nicholas?
I'm good. Thank you, Ben.
So to start us off, the most important question we should be asking is, how can someone who vapes quit?
It is a great question. And it also depends on what is in the vape. So a lot of young people will vape liquids that contain nicotine. And we know that nicotine is also found in cigarettes and other tobacco products. It can be quite addictive. But some people can also vape other products like cannabis, and that also can be addictive. So how can we quit? Well, there's several ways to quit. The first thing is to set some goals. If we're interested in reducing or stopping, it's a good thing to think of when and how and who will tell and where to get support, right? So there are some tools that can be out there to help. But one really important thing is to find trusted people around us to help us exactly find our motivations or goals and to decide how we're going to do it. Are we going to do it all in one day? Are we going to do it gradually? And also, are we going to use some tools that can be available for teens, such as nicotine replacement products, or even with the help of some doctors, sometimes some medications to reduce the cravings, the wanting to use the vape. So there are several ways, and there are also some newer tools like apps or online platforms that can really give us hints and tips to support us along the way. So several tools, and it's a question of finding what's right for us.
Yeah, and what will these tools tell us? Will that tell us to change our routine? I mean, what do these tools actually give us that helps us quit vaping?
Right. So one important thing to understand is why we hooked up on vaping. Is it the habit? Is it the social aspect of it? Is it the feeling that we get? So trying to identify what is the thing that draws us towards vaping is a good first step, right? So if we see that it's really kind of integrated in a routine, it's something we do in the morning or with friends or after school or during the weekends, then try to identify some alternatives to vaping, other things that can be done that are healthier. And also really important to identify the motivations to quit, right? So why would we want to quit? Because we think it's unhealthy, because we want to focus on other things, because we think it might be expensive, for example. So all good reasons, and trying to identify those. And so that's really what the online tools and apps will do. They'll try to kind of help young people understand why they started doing, what they like about it, what they don't like about it, and try to kind of help them organize their thoughts in terms of setting their own goals.
Absolutely. So I'm going to create a hypothetical situation, and I don't vape, but I'm just going to treat myself as if I do vape. And I'm going to say I've sort of become addicted from vaping from my friends, and it's been a social thing. And now I'm hooked onto the regular nicotine vape. What advice would you give me to try to get over this addiction?
Well, first of all, trying to see what is it that we're using, right? So you said nicotine vapes. So if we've been vaping for quite a while, it's possible that if we stop all of a sudden, we won't feel that good. The brain, the body is going to say, "Oh, I'm used to this. I want more." Right? So getting just ready to feel that your body's screaming for more if you stop. So that's sort of one thing that's kind of a good thing to keep in mind. And then if it's a social thing, as you said in your scenario, right, with friends maybe and using a traditional nicotine vape, then maybe telling people around, trying to get support and just to say people, okay, I'm going to quit vaping. I'm going to do it next week. I'm going to do it this weekend. And maybe take a very concrete step like giving away your vape or throwing it away or giving it to a trusted adult just to really help avoid kind of the temptation of doing it and using it and finding some really good distractions too, right? Because if you stop, you might want to do it again. So if you're into sports or arts or culture or reading, anything that can be kind of a fun and helpful hobby, hanging out with friends that don't vape, for example, all those things can help if you're really trying to change, get your mind off things and not be focusing on the vape.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned throwing the vape away or doing all these things, but it isn't as simple as that, obviously, as we know, because it's an addiction. It's one of those things where it's in your head, you crave it, you actually almost want it because you're addicted to it. Why is it bad to vape? And what are the health consequences of vaping to try not convince these people, but to allow these people who are addicted to vaping to understand why it's bad?
That's very important, and it's also a broad question because the harms related to vaping are varied. So there are many of them. So we talked about the addictive kind of nature of nicotine. So getting hooked up on a substance when you're a teen can have an impact on how your brain develops. It can also impact how your emotions are regulated. So using a lot of nicotine when you're 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and even into your early 20s can have an impact that will kind of affect the future and how your brain is shaped, and also it might make your brain more sensitive to being addicted to other substances like alcohol or cannabis or other drugs if you try them. So that's kind of the addiction side of it. But then if you use a lot of nicotine or a lot of vaping, it might also have an impact on your functioning, right? It might affect how you sleep, how you eat. It could have an impact on your appetite. And some people who vape a lot really are always kind of trying to vape more or need to vape more. So it interferes with your activities, could interfere with your school activities, with your sports activities, your cultural activities. So it will affect how you grow and develop as a young person, and how do you thrive as a young person, right? And then there are all the physical health aspects of vaping. So we know that what comes out of a vape is what's called an aerosol. It's a mix of water vapor and fine particles, also with the nicotine if it contains nicotine. So if that aerosol goes into your lungs, it can cause inflammation, it can cause health problems, it can increase cough. If you already have problems like asthma or breathing problems, it can make them worse. And we're starting to understand that if you're an athlete or someone who wants to perform in sports, then vaping can also make you more short of breath and can affect your performance and your capacity. We also know that because of the chemicals that are found in the aerosols, there could be some effects on other parts of your body. It could have an effect on your blood vessels, on your heart. It could eventually be damageable and perhaps increase your risk of getting different types of cancers. And some of those risks we're just starting to understand because vaping is pretty new. Right? It wasn't a very popular thing 10, 15 years ago. It was only something that a few adults would do perhaps to help them quit smoking. And in the past 5, 10 years, it's really exploded as a trend that so many teens are taking on. So we're going to need time to know exactly what the effects are kind of long-term on the body, but we already are starting to understand that there are some risks and some harms, such as those that I've mentioned. And finally, the last thing that I'll say is some young people might use vaping as a way to cope or help them with sort of feeling depressed or feeling anxious. What we understand is that nicotine or vaping is not a cure for those things. Maybe it could help you feel better in the moment, but very oftentimes it can make the feeling of anxiety or depression worse after you've come off the effect of the vaping. So you get caught in this cycle where you think you might be doing that could be helpful for you, but it's actually not, and it could be damageable in many ways, as I just mentioned.
Absolutely. And can you explain what vaping actually is and why it is such a big issue among the teenage bodies today?
So vaping is using an electronic device that can look like a very small flash drive or USB key or a pen. And there are some bigger devices that have a reservoir, a tank that contains liquid. And basically what the vape does is it has an heating element. It heats up a liquid that gets turned into what I mentioned, an aerosol, so a mix of hot water vapor and fine particles. And then the person who uses it just inhales it in their lungs, right? So the aerosol comes into the body, and if there's nicotine, it gets absorbed. And so all vaping devices, they can look different, but they all pretty much function the same way. And there are different types of liquids that can be put into vaping devices. And I mentioned at the beginning, we could use nicotine-containing liquids or cannabis-containing liquids, or some liquids don't contain either of them. It could be flavored or unflavored liquids that don't contain nicotine, but different possibilities there.
Yeah, and there's a constant argument about vaping was almost to try to replace the addiction of smoking. Is vaping worse than smoking? Do we know if it's worse than smoking? Is it similar to smoking? How can we compare vaping and the likes of cigarettes?
That's a very tricky and important question. So what I'll say is that there's starting to be more and more evidence showing that if we compare taking one puff from a cigarette versus taking one puff from a vape, it would most likely be safer to take one puff from a vape. The big problem here is that most young people who vape are not people who smoke cigarettes. That's what we're seeing around the world now. Vaping has become more popular than smoking among young people, among teens. And so we can't really say that one is safer than the other because we're not necessarily talking about replacing, we're talking about a new behavior, right? So young people starting to vape as something trendy, as something that other people do, as something that might seem fun, it has its risks. Puff per puff, it might be less risky than smoking. But if you can just take the risks of vaping alone, there are some risks that are considerable. And so young people shouldn't be doing it if they want to take care of their health or be as healthy as they can. So the answer might be different for someone who's a heavy smoker, for example. Some adults have smoked cigarettes for years and years and are trying to to be healthier, right? To reduce the harms of their smoking. So in that case, if they're able to switch completely from smoking cigarettes to vaping, and then hopefully eventually they can get off vaping altogether, right? And not smoke anything or vape anything, then that would be healthy. But for a lot of young people, it doesn't necessarily go that way. So a lot of teens will start with vaping, and then they may try smoking after that, and they may do a bit of both. And in that case, then lungs can get exposed to different chemicals, the chemicals from vaping and those from smoking, and that combination isn't healthy, right? So it's more a question of understanding the risks of vaping and the risks of smoking, and for young people, try not to do either, ideally.
Yeah, and from what you've seen, is smoking or vaping more addictive?
That also may depend. Some studies have shown that some types of vapes are very addictive and even more addictive than cigarettes. One thing to keep in mind is that a lot of vapes come with flavors, right? So they don't leave that kind of nasty smell that we might get from a cigarette. And that kind of experience of using the vape might be more pleasurable for young people and may more quickly lead to an addiction, for example. We know that cigarettes also can be quite addictive, and so kind of depending on who you are, where you're at, and maybe who you're using with, both can be quite addictive. But in some young people, yes, vapes can be even more addictive than cigarettes.
Absolutely. So we've dealt with how you quit and why it's bad. What advice would you give to those who are being put into an environment where people are encouraging them to try it? What would you tell them regarding not trying it, or who are considering to try it?
Well, one thing is, I work with adolescents. I'm a pediatrician, and a lot of teens will tell me, well, everyone vapes. So in Canada, it is quite common, but it's not true, actually. Not everyone vapes. More than half of teens of high school students don't vape. And so just thinking that it's okay and it's normal not to try it, and it's healthier, right? So the good advice is, if you're a teen, you're growing, your brain is evolving, you're trying to reach your maximum potential, then staying away from substances like nicotine or behaviors like vaping will be the healthiest thing. So that's kind of the first thing to think about. And also just reminding yourself as a teen that, there are many ways to have fun as a teen and enjoy yourself. And there are many things that can be done socially. Using substances is one of those things that can be seen as fun, as something that a lot of people do, but there's so many other things that can be done and that are certainly healthy. And, I'm thinking about sports, for example, or doing any kind of sports or music or activities, and really kind of focusing on that and reminding yourself that it's more than okay. It's good if you're not trying it, then that's kind of a good first step. And having honest conversations also about, just like we've discussed, some of the risks that come with vaping, and also the inconveniences. It is costly, right? You have to get it. You may get into trouble if you're a teen and you're vaping in different places where you're not supposed to, and all that. And struggling with being kind of hooked on it isn't all that great. You're kind of stuck with that problem, and always kind of trying to find more vapes and stuff. So trying it once probably won't get you hooked up or addicted, but it could lead to using more. And so just before you even try and start, thinking about, good reasons not to start and not to use.
Absolutely. So we obviously live in a very competitive world where achieving good marks may lead to being in a good university or achieving success. And one of the main focuses in this podcast is success and achieving that success from a young age. How does vaping impact a teenager's academic performance and overall success in their life?
So I'm going to share a story from a young person I worked with. And so, as I mentioned, I'm a pediatrician, and I see young people who have struggled with addiction or with problems related to substances. And one young person I remember working with was just finishing high school and getting ready to get into college, and started vaping both nicotine and cannabis. And so he was a very competitive athlete. He was playing basketball and volleyball, and all of a sudden he found himself caught in a cycle where, because he was vaping so much, it was interfering with his sports, but also with his kind of motivation and energy to do schoolwork. He was skipping class. He had been a very good student up to then. He was, hanging out with friends and not doing his work. And so there was really a shift in how his life was kind of happening, and his activities and his motivations. And then when he came to see me, he told me, he's like, I can't think of anything else. It's taken over so much of my space, my energy, and my interests. And so we worked together to have him kind of focus on what are his real goals. Like, what is success for him? What does he want to achieve when he's older? Where does he want to get to in school and in college? And so it did take time, and we found several different tricks and tips to help him kind of cut down and eventually quit vaping both nicotine and cannabis, with the help of a counselor, with the help of his family and his friends also, who were supportive. And then I had also helped him with nicotine replacement gums that he was using when he was feeling like he really had to use. And so that could be a way that he used to replace the vaping. And so in the end, it was a very successful outcome for this young man. He was able to quit vaping and go back to his sports, find his motivation, get admitted to a competitive college program. And so you could see how vaping can, for some people, take over. That's one example. And for some other people, vaping may sort of make sleep or health or mental health kind of just not as good, right? So if I think that all students need to sleep well and eat well and feel energized when they go to school so they can perform. And sometimes if you start vaping a lot and doing it even at night, for example, maybe your sleep might not be as good, and you may not be able to focus and do your work as well as you would. So I've seen that a few times in some of the young people I've cared for. So those are just some examples. So definitely, we know that there is kind of a link to make there, and it's definitely advisable to try to stay away from vaping if you're wanting to focus on school and some other goals that you want to pursue.
You mentioned vaping gums. Can you please explain what that is?
So let me clarify. I'm not talking about vaping gums. Obviously, it'd be hard to vape and chew at the same time, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about nicotine, whether it comes from a cigarette or a vape, well, there are some safer ways of taking nicotine that would help us quit, right? So for a long time, adults have been using nicotine patches that they put on their skin, or chewing a gum that also contains nicotine, and they would do that instead of smoking. So some young people who have really, really strong addiction to vaping nicotine, they feel like they just can't quit all in one go, right? It's too hard. It's too big a step to quit because their body's kind of screaming for it. So these safer ways of taking nicotine, like a patch or a gum, or sometimes putting the patch on the whole day and using a gum also, as a way of replacing the nicotine that would come from the vape in a healthier way, in a safer way. That's obviously something that would be done for a short period of time while the body kind of gets used to using less and less nicotine. And so that's an approach that can be used, is starting to be used a little bit more in Canada and the US and in other parts of the world to help and support young people and adults who want to quit smoking and vaping.
Yeah, and what should schools do to try to prevent this? Because the classic discipline just isn't working. And as we're discussing this, obviously it is an addiction, and it's something you can't just get rid of overnight. If you get a discipline, something, whatever, just because you're vaping, it doesn't help. What should schools do to try to prevent vaping among their students?
I work with schools a lot, with elementary schools and high schools. And I think the very first thing to do is to offer information and education. And so I work with actually medical students who've put together some information workshops for high school students to tell them, what is vaping? A little bit like what we're discussing now. What are the risks? And what are the bad sides from it? So there's some kind of myths that circulate. So some young people may think that vaping actually isn't very harmful. It's something that's clean because the smell is the smell of a flavor, and it's not like a cigarette. So it's something that we could just do like that, and there's no risk really. So starting with informing young people about what comes with vaping and where it could lead to. And then, as you said, being just kind of punitive and putting these very strict rules and forbid it everywhere. Well, if we just do that, that's hard, right? Because some young people are already vaping and they will feel excluded. They won't be able to kind of do their work if they're being expelled from school. So I think it's important to have some rules, to have some boundaries. I don't think that young people should be vaping in class or in school spaces. So having those rules kind of clear and consistent throughout. And then mostly, I would say, offering support to young people who need help, right? So if you're caught with this problem, well, I don't think it's useful to say, well, it's your fault, you shouldn't do it, you're a bad person because you tried vaping and you're hooked up on it. No, I mean, probably if you have that problem, you need help, right? Especially if you want to stop and you want to cut down. So offering counseling and support, or even being able to see a health professional to get some guidance and get access to some peer support sometimes. And I think one thing that'd be really helpful is some adolescents have vaped and have stopped successfully, right? So they can be peer mentors. They can really guide their friends or even younger peers or older peers in trying to cut down and quit. So I think it's a team effort there. So schools need to act on many different kind of things. There should be some rules, because obviously vaping all the time, always, or allowing it will make it very difficult for people who have the problem to quit and stop. And it's also very distracting, and we know there are harms. But then especially offering education and support from adults, but also from peers, I think could be very, very helpful. And it's working well in some schools where I see this happening in Canada.
Absolutely. So you've done a lot of research on the topic of vaping, which is ongoing, because as we know, it's a very new thing in our world. And as we keep researching, we'll develop more understanding of how bad it may be and how bad the addiction is. Are there any other specific facts or information that you believe is very important for teenagers and parents to know?
There are several different things that are important when it comes to vaping. One that I'll mention is I've done some research on what we call e-cigarette or vaping associated lung injuries. So in North America a few years ago, just before the COVID pandemic, there was a series of very severe cases. So young people and adults coming to the hospital, being very, very sick because they had vaped, vapes that contain specific chemicals. So we know that some vapes are sold illegally, depending on the country where you're at. Maybe it's just illegal to sell vapes at all, but some come from kind of distributors that aren't verified, and the liquids that are in the vapes actually can contain some chemicals that are very dangerous. And that's actually something that happened 3-4 years ago, where there were hundreds of people using a certain type of vape with a liquid called vitamin E acetate. And that made the lungs really sick. Some people even died from it. And so there are risks related to some vaping products that are not as verified, right? So if we don't know where they come from, if some people even will create their vaping liquids themselves, right? They'll go on the internet, they'll look at videos, they'll mix some chemicals together. That can be very risky, right? Especially if you're kind of playing with the mechanism itself. Maybe the temperature is very hot, you can burn yourself in doing it and stuff. So there are kind of risks and hazards with vaping that can change through time and depending on what type of vapes you're using. And also we're talking about kind of teens using vapes, but if a young child uses a vape, and sometimes the vape liquid can come in a little bottle that looks like a bottle of juice or candy, and that can be very dangerous. So if you use too much, or if you even drink that liquid, then you can get nicotine toxicity or intoxicated from the nicotine. That's kind of another risk. So if you're a teen and you have like a younger brother or a younger cousin, you don't want to leave your vape kind of there, your vaping liquid just there in the home. So there are some risks related to that. So that's some of the research that I'm kind of involved with, trying to understand, are there these kind of big health problems that happen in the moment, and how can we prevent them, right? And one thing is just making sure that the vaping products themselves are safer. And we had talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but vaping, the initial idea with vaping was to find a safer way of using nicotine than smoking. And it's kind of changed to not really be that for a lot of teens. But I think we still need to kind of focus on helping older adults who are smokers get access to the vapes and use them in a healthy way that would help them kind of improve their health. And that's kind of another thing that I'm interested in. Is it really working to help adults quit? And can be helpful for some adults to help quit smoking, but not for everyone. And so it's something that we still need to kind of try to work on and see what kind of vapes are the best for that.
Absolutely. And these children or teenagers per se, and young adults who have friends who are vaping, what advice would you give to them to try and make a positive impact on the situation in trying to help their friends and possibly even family members overcome this huge issue?
I think first of all, just being able to talk about it, and so not making it a taboo topic, making it something that we can discuss openly. Some people are vaping and feel like they just want to continue doing it this time, and maybe that'll change for them. So if you're a friend, if you're a sibling, if you're an older, brother or cousin, just being there to say that you can listen and you're there to talk about it. If someone's hooked up on vaping and they want to stop, they'll need support. They'll want to have maybe you or another friend as someone who can just be there to say, oh, okay, like nice work. You've been able to not use it for a day or two, or just share some goals and stuff. So just opening that door, being able to have the conversation, I think is a really good thing. And also maybe just saying, oh, have you thought of getting some more help? Have you thought of going to a counselor or to a health professional or doctor to help you with it? Just kind of offering those suggestions, or even trying to, look for some resources online, and there's some good ones, and just being there to help out with that process. I think all those things are helpful things to do.
Absolutely. And for these people who don't want to stop vaping, and I'm not sure how it is in Canada, but I know in South Africa it is a under 18 illegal thing, which vaping is. And for these underage people who are vaping but don't want to stop, what would you tell them?
So, of course, as a pediatrician, I will tell them that the healthiest thing they can do for their bodies and for their brains is to quit using. But I know that can be hard, and people vape for different reasons, and they may not be ready and they might not want to. So, well, as a professional, what I'll say is, well, every time I see you, I'll talk about it with you, and we'll try to see where you're at, and I'll share a few of the kind of the consequences of vaping, and you'll tell me what you like and don't like about vaping, and we'll just keep that conversation going, right? If you're a friend and your other friend is saying, I just don't want to quit, I'm not ready, I think you can do something similar, right? Just kind of touch base now and then and discuss that, from time to time, and just kind of respect their choice, but being there to listen and to help if they need to. And one thing that you can do as a friend also is, well, have you tried to not do it for one day, right? Just stop for a short period of time, see how that feels for you. Offering that kind of suggestions and support, or just simply say, you know what, maybe I don't vape, you do. How about we do something that doesn't involve vaping and see how that feels for you? And then, we can talk about it. So, all sorts of ideas can be done, but if you're there and it's your friend, you want to be there to support and listen.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there a difference in how prevalent vaping is between guys and girls?
That is a good question. It's a little bit different depending on what part of the world we're in. It used to be that vaping was a little bit more common among boys than among girls, and that's actually changing in many parts of the world. It's being pretty even. It also depends on the age. So in younger teens, a little bit more common in boys, but then it's really evening up. So I would say it's quite common in both boys and girls, in teens around the world. But in some communities or some groups, it might be a little bit more in boys than girls, and maybe sometimes even more than girls and boys. It really depends.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, and hopefully I can get this podcast to as many vape addicts or people who are addicted to vaping as possible to try to help them. So thank you. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks, Ben. It was a great conversation.